Who really controls the US dollar? The hidden power behind the world's most important currency. Picture this: a room in Washington, D.C. No cameras, no politicians, no votes. Just 12 people sitting around a table. And with a single decision, they can move trillions of dollars in seconds. They can make your mortgage more expensive. They can determine if you keep your job. They can shake stock markets from New York to Tokyo. Who are these people? They are not elected. You can not vote them out. Most people do not even know their names. Yet, they control the most powerful financial weapon in human history, the US dollar. But here is the twist. Even they do not fully control it, because the dollar is not controlled by people. It is controlled by something more complex. A system. A system designed over a century ago. A system built to survive presidents, wars, and financial collapse. A system that shapes your life every single day, whether you realize it or not. So, who really controls the US dollar? Is it the president, Congress, Wall Street bankers, foreign governments, or is it something else entirely? The answer will surprise you, because control over the dollar is not what you think. It is not about power. It is about trust. And whoever controls trust, control everything. Let me show you how deep this goes. Most people believe the US dollar is printed by the government, by the treasury, by politicians in suits. That is partially true, but it misses the entire point. The dollar you hold, the dollar in your bank account, the dollar that determines gas prices, food costs, and your retirement savings. That dollar is not controlled by elected officials. It is controlled by the Federal Reserve, the Fed, an institution most Americans have heard of, but few truly understand. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It was created in 1913, not 1776, not with the Constitution. More than a century after America's founding. Why? Because before 1930, America did not have a permanent central authority over money, and that caused chaos. Financial panics erupted regularly. In 1873, banks collapsed. In 1893, unemployment soared. In 1907, the entire banking system nearly disintegrated. There was no safety net, no emergency lender, no institution to stop the bleeding. So what happened? One man stepped in, not a politician, not a general, a banker, J.P. Morgan. In 1907, during the worst panic in decades, Morgan gathered the most powerful bankers in America inside his private library. He walked the doors and he forced them to coordinate emergency loans to prevent total collapse. One private citizen stabilized the American financial system. Think about that. One man had more power than the entire US government in a financial crisis. That terrifies everybody. Politicians realized something dangerous. Private power could replace public authority. If one banker could save the system, one banker could also destroy it. The solution? Create a central bank. But here is the genius. They did not make it fully government controlled, and they did not make it fully private either. They created a hybrid, an institution designed to be independent of politics, but accountability to the public. This was the Federal Reserve, and its structure tells you everything about control. The Federal Reserve is not one building. It is not one person. It is a network, a carefully designed system with layers of authority. At the top sits the Board on Governance, 7 people, based in Washington, D.C., inside a marble fortress that looks like a temple. These 7 governors are appointed by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate. They sound political, right? But here is the catch. They serve 14-year terms. 14 years. Longer than any president can serve. Longer than most senators stay in office. Why? Because independence was built into the NAO system. A governor appointed by one president will serve under 3 or 4 presidents. They can not be fired for making unpopular decisions. They are insulated from political cycles. Beneath the board or governments are 12 wrestling Federal Reserve banks: New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, and others scattered across the country. These are not government offices. They are quasi-private institutions. In fact, private banks own shares in these regional Fed banks. Yes, you heard that right. But do not misunderstanding. This is ownership like owning Apple stock. Shareholders cannot sell their shares. They cannot control decisions. They reserve a fixed 6% dividend. Nothing more. The real power lies elsewhere, in a committee. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC. This is monetary policy is made. 12 voting members, the 7 governors, plus the president of the New York Fed, plus 4 the retiring presidents from other regional Fed banks. These 12 people meet 8 times a year in secret. No cameras, no live broadcasts, only minutes released weeks later. And in those minutes, they make decisions that ripple across the entire planet. They set interest rates. They control the money supply. They influence inflation, employment, and economic growth. When the FOMC says rates will rise, mortgages become more expensive. When they says rates will fall, stock markets rally. Their words move trillions, not with force, not with laws, with signals, with expectations, with trust. So, who controls the dollar? Technically, the Federal Reserve. But who controls the Federal Reserve? Now the question gets interesting. Here is what most people believe. The president controls the economy. When the economy is good, the president takes credit. When it is bad, the president gets blamed. But the president has very limited direct control over the dollar. Yes, the president appoints the chair of the Federal Reserve, the most visibly face all monetary places. Currently, that is Jerome Powell. Before him, Janet Yellen. Before her, Ben Bernanke. Before him, Alan Greenspan. And before him, the legendary Paul Volcker. These names carry weight because when the Fed chair speaks, markets listen. But here is the key. Once appointed, the chair does not answer to the president. Not daily, not even yearly. The chair serves a firm and can be reappointed, but cannot be fired for policy disagreements. This is by design. If the president could control the Fed directly, what would happen? Interest rates would drop before every election. Short-term economic busts, artificial growths to win votes, but long-term inflation, currency collapse, economic disaster. Independence prevents that, but independence also creates tensions. Presidents have publicly criticized the Fed. Donald Trump repeatedly attacked Jerome Powell for not lowering rates fast enough. Before him, other presidents pressured Fed chairs privately. Lyndon Johnson physically shoved Fed Chair William McChesney Martin against a wall, demanding lower rates. Yes, that actually happened, but the Feds resisted because credibility depends on independence. The moment the Feds become a political tool, trust collapses, and without trust, the dollar loses its power. So the Fed fucks a trade trap, accountability to Congress through testimony, transparent through public statements, but operationally independent. Nobody can order the Fed to act. Not the president, not Congress, not Wall Street. But that raises another question. If politicians do not control the Fed, does Wall Street? This is where conspiracy theories thrive. Critics argue the Fed is too close to Wall Street, that it serves big banks, that it protects financial elites over ordinary people. Is there truth to this? Partially. The Federal Reserve was designed with input from bankers. The architects of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act met secretly on Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private retreat. Bankers and policymakers drafting the structure of America's central bank in secret. That alone fuels suspicion, but the reality is more nuanced. The Fed's legal mandate is clear: price stability, maximum employment, moderate long-term interest rates. Notice what is missing? Stock market performance, corporate profits, Wall Street bonuses. Those are not part of the mandate. But in practice, the lines blur because the financial system is interconnected. When big banks fail, small banks fail. When credit freezes, business cannot borrow. When business cannot borrow, people lose jobs. So, stabilizing Wall Street often means stabilizing Main Street. But it does not always feel that way, especially during crises. In 2008, the Fed intervened massively to save the financial system. It bailed out banks. Some failed anyway. Lehman Brothers collapsed, but others were rescued. AIG, Bear Stearns, Citigroup. Ordinary people saw this favoritism. Why save banks but not homeowners? Why rescue Wall Street but let Main Street suffer? The Fed's answer was structural. Its job is to prevent systematic collapse, not to pick winners and losers. If the entire banking system fails, everyone loses. Jobs vanish, savings disappear, credit evaporates. So the Fed acts as a lender of last resorts. It provides liquidity when markets freeze. It stabilizes institutions deemed too big to fail. Is this fair? That is a political question. But is it necessary? Systemical, yes. The Fed does not control the dollar to enrich bankers. It controls the dollar to maintain financial stability. And financial stability benefits everyone, even if the process feels unequal. So, does Wall Street control the Fed? No. But does Wall Street influence the Fed? Indirectly, yes, because the financial markets are the mechanism through which monetary policy works. The Fed sets rates, but markets determine how those rates affect the economy, and that brings us to the real answer. Here is the truth. The Federal Reserve influences the dollar, but it does not command it. Markets do. global markets. The US dollar is not just American money, it is the world's reserve currency. Central banks from China to Switzerland hold dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. International debts is denominated in dollars. Trade across continents is settled in dollars. Why? Because the dollar is trusted, liquid, stable, backed by the largest economy on earth, enforced by the most powerful military in history, supported by deep, transparent financial markets. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, capital flows into the United States. Why? Because investors chase returns. Higher US rates make dollar-denominated assets more attractive. Money flows in. The dollar strengthens. When the Fed lowers rates, the opposite happens. Capital seeks higher returns elsewhere. The dollar weakens, so the Fed sets policy. But markets respond, and markets are global. The Fed cannot force the world to value the dollar. It can only maintain the conditions that make the dollar valuable. This is why credibility matters more than control. If markets believe the Fed will fight inflation, the dollar strengthens higher than 20%. Mortgages became unaffordable. Business failed. Unemployment soared. People hated him. Politicians pressured him to stop, but Walker held firm because he understood something fundamental. Short-term pain was necessary for long-term credibility. If the Fed caved to political pressure, inflation would never stop. The dollar would collapse. So Walker inflicted recessions to save the currency, and it worked. Inflation fell, the dollar stabilized. Trust was restored. Walker did not control the dollar through force. He controlled it through discipline. That lesson still defines the Fed today. Control is not about printing money. It is about the restraint. The question of control becomes clearest during crisis, because crises reveal who can act when seconds matter. In 2008, the global financial system faced its worst crisis since the Great Depressions. It started with housing, subprime mortgages, risky loans bundled into complex securities, sold to investors worldwide. When housing prices began to fall, the entire structure started cracking. Then it shattered. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest investment banks in America, collapsed. Overnight, credit markets froze. Banks stopped trusting each other. The financial system runs one visible ingredient: liquidity, the flow of money between institutions, and suddenly it vanished. And that moment, control over the dollar meant one thing: who can inject liquidity fast enough to stop a chain reaction? The Federal Reserve stepped in, not Congress, not the President, the Fed. It lowered interest rates to near zero. But that was not enough. So It did something unprecedented, something radical. It began buying massive amounts of assets directly: treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities. This was called quantitative easing, QE. The Fed created new money electronically, used it to purchase assets from banks. This injected liquidity into the system, prevented collapse, stabilized markets. Critics called it a bailout. Supporters called necessary, but the truth is structural. In a crisis, the Fed has powers no other institution possesses. It can expand the money supply instantly. It can lend to institutions others will not touch. It can act without waiting for congressional approval. And in 2008, it did exactly that. The Fed's balance sheet exploded. Before the crisis, it held less than $1 trillion in assets. Within a few years, over $4 trillion. That expansion reshapes global finance. For the first time in modern history, money creation was not stepped. It was visible, massive, impossible to ignore, and it changed everything. Quantitative easing fundamentally altered how the Fed controls the dollar. Before 2008, monetary policy worked primarily through interest rates. Lower rates to stimulate growth, raise rates to cool inflation. Simple, predictable. After 2008, the Fed controlled financial conditions through direct assets purchase. That is a completely different mechanism. Interest rates influence borrowing costs. Asset purchases influence markets directly. By buying bonds, the Fed pushed bond prices up, which pushed yields down. Lower yields forced investors into riskier assets: stocks, real estate, corporate bonds. Asset prices surged. Markets boomed. The S&P 500 more than tripled from the 2009 lows. Housing recovered. Wealth grew. But who benefited most? Those who owned assets. The wealthy, investors, property owners. Those without assets, they saw wages stagnate, rent increase, the cost of living rise. QA saved the economy, but it also widened inequality, and it created a new dynamic. Markets became addicted to Fed support. Every hint of tightening caused panic. Every suggestion of more QA caused rallies. The Fed chair became the most watched voice in finance. Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen before him, Ben Bernanke before her. Every word analyzed, every pause interpreted. Markets hung on every label. This was not conspiracy. It was signaling, because in modern finance, expectations matter as much as actions. If investors believe the Fed will support markets, they buy. If they believe the Fed will tighten, they sell. The Fed learned to manage expectations, to guide markets gently, to avoid shocks. This is called forward guidance. and it became a primary tool of control, not just setting rates, but shaping what people believe about future rates. Control over the dollar was no longer just monetary. It became philosophical, narrative-driven, based on trust in the Fed's credibility, and that trust will be tested again. Then came 2020. A virus emerged in China, spread globally. Within weeks, entire economies shut down. Travel stopped. Business closed. Production halted. Unemployment spiked faster than during the Great Depression. 30 million Americans filed for unemployment in 6 weeks. The stock market collapsed. Oil prices briefly went negative. The world faced simultaneous supply and demand shocks, panic, and once again the question returned: who can prevent total collapse? The Federal Reserve moved faster than ever before. It cut rates to zero within days, launched emergency lending programs, brought assets aggressively. The Fed balance sheet surged past 7 trillion, then 8 trillion. Meanwhile, Congress passed massive fiscal stimulus, the CARES Act, trillions in spending, direct payments to households, expanded unemployment benefits, loans to business. Governments and central banks worldwide did the same. Money flooded the system. For a moment, collapse was avoided. Markets stabilized. The economy began recovering, but the story did not end there. Because when economies reopened, demand returned quickly. People wanted to travel, to buy, to consume. But supply chains remained broken. Factories were still disrupted. Shipping was delayed. Shortages emerged. And then inflation returned. Not the mild inflation of recent decades, but significant, persistent inflation. Prices rose. First, gradually, then rapidly. By 2022, inflation reached levels not seen 40 years, over 800%. Gas prices soared, food costs surged, rent skyrocketed. People felt in their daily lives, and they demanded answers. Had the Fed expanded the money supply too much? Had Congress spent too recklessly? Was this the consequences of crisis information? The Fed faced a new challenge: fight inflation. Even if it meant causing pain, even if it meant slowing the economy, even if it meant crashing markets, once again credibility was on the line. In 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates aggressively, not gradually, rapidly, in increments not seen in decades. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, was clear. Inflation must be brought under control, even if it hurts. Stock markets fell. Bonds sold off. Housing slowed. Tech companies laid off workers. Cryptocurrencies crashed. The pain was real, but the Fed did not flinch. Why? Because credibility required it. If the Fed had resisted, markets would have lost faith. Inflation would have superlated. Dollar would have weakened. Trust would have collapsed. The echoed Paul Volcker's approach in the 80s, short-term pain for long-term stability. Restraint over popularity, discipline over politics. The Fed is designed to make unpopular decisions. That is the entire point of independence. Politicians face elections. They need approval. They respond to voters. The Fed does not. It responds to economic data, to inflation, to employment, to financial stability. Not the polls, not the tweets, not the pressure. This is why structure matters. 14 years terms governors, 4-year terms for chair, committee-based decisions, transparency through statements and projections, all designed to maintain credibility, because credibility is the foundation of control. If markets believe the Fed will act responsibly, the dollar remains strong. If markets lose faith, no amount of information will save it. This is real power behind the dollar. Not force, not wealth, not political authority. Trust. Institutional trust. Built over decades, maintained through discipline, enforced through independence. And that brings us to the ultimate question. The US dollar dominates global finance. It represents 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. It is used in roughly 19% of international transactions. Oil is priced in dollars. Commodities are traded in dollars. Debt worldwide and issued in dollars. This gives the United States enormous power. The ability to borrow cheaply, to impose sanctions, to influence global capital flows. But is this dominance permanent? No. History shows that reserve currency change. The British pound once dominated. Before that, the Dutch guilder. Dominance is not granted by the law. It survives because of trusts, and trust depends on stability, economic scale, political reliability, legal structure, military power, financial market depth. If those pillars weaken, the dollar weakens. So could that dollar be replaced? Theoretically, yes. Realistically, not easily. Because no alternative currency matches the dollar's combination of attributes. The euro, it lacks fiscal unity. The Eurozone is a monetary union without a true fiscal union. Countries share a currency but not a government. That creates fragility. The Chinese yuan, China is a massive economy, but the yuan is not fully convertible. Capital controls restricts its use. China does not have deep, transparent financial markets, and political unpredictability undermines trust. Gold, that lacks flexibility, cannot expand with economic growth, cannot adapt to crisis. To volatile, not backed by economic production, not supported by legal systems, not widely accepted. So the dollar remains dominant, but not because it's perfect, but because it's the best available option. And As long as that remains true, control over the dollar means control over a critical piece of the global financial system. But that control is not absolute. It is conditional, based on maintaining the pillars that support dollar's dominance, and those pillars require constant vigilance. So, we return to the original question. Who really controls the US dollar? The answer is layered. The Federal Reserve's control monetary policy. It sets interest rates, manages the money supply, acts as lender of last resort, stabilizes the financial system. But the Fed does not act in a vacuum. Congress influences fiscal policy, spending, taxation, deficits. These affects demand in inflation. The president appoints leadership, sets economy priorities, shapes regulatory frameworks. Wall Street and global markets enforce discipline. If policies are reckless, markets punish. Capital waits. The dollar weakens. Interest rates rise, and ultimately trust is the binding force. Trust is in institutions. Trust in rule of the law. Trust in economy fundamentals. Trust in political stability. Without trust, control disappears. No amount of information can save currency people do not believe in. This is why the dollar has survived through wars, depressions, financial crisis, political turmoil. It has survived because the system behind it is resilient, not perfect, not immune to mistakes, but structured to absorb shocks, to balance competing interests, to maintain independence while remaining uncountable. It is controlled by belief, and belief maintained through discipline, through transparency, through credibility. This is hidden active power, invisibly to most, but essential of everything. The president does not wake up and decide the value of the dollar. Congress does not vote on its strength. Wall Street does not command it through wealth alone. The US dollar is governed by a system built over more than a century, a system designed to balance independence with accountability, power with restraint, action with credibility. It is imperfect. It has made mistakes. 2008 revolt weakness, COVID tested limits, inflation challenged credibility, but the system adapted. It learned, it evolved, because that is what resilient systems do. Control over the dollar is not about domination. It is about stability. And stability survives only where trust survives. This is the real power behind the world's most important currency. Not bullets, not gold, not politicians, but the invisible architecture of institutional trusts, boiled over generations, tested in every crisis, and maintained through constant vigilance. The dollar is powerful because the system is incredible. The credibility is the ultimate form of control. This is the truth about money, about power, about the hidden forces that shape your world every single day, whatever you see them or not. This is Money, Power, History.